Well, in many quarters today, there's increasing concern about this hyper political correctness, which has gripped our campuses, certainly, but other forms of public conversation as well. There are trigger warnings, on all sorts of works of literature and philosophy, warnings that there's, sexism or homophobia or classism in the book, from Huckleberry Finn to Heart of Darkness. And my favorite example is Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Had a trigger warning about classism or something. So it's to warn people that, oh, there's something here that might, upset your sensibilities. Also, you find on the campuses what they call safe spaces. So places where students can go who might be offended by, the raucous exchange of opinions or a confrontation with a view that's not their own. My favorite example of this one took place at Brown University, evidently, where in advance of a public debate, so even before it happened, they created a safe space that had film of like frolicking puppies, and they had Play-Doh, and they had coloring books, a place where the students could go just because they were thinking about a possible confrontation. So even the prospect of a disagreeable opinion sent them to an updated version of daycare. One of the, I think, interesting concomitants of all this is an increase in really bullying and verbal aggressiveness. Because, see, once public conversation breaks down, the opportunity to have a real argument publicly, all you've got left is aggressiveness and censorship and bullying. So that's the kind of parlous state that we're in terms of public conversation. Now, I could walk further down the road of sort of mocking all this, and God knows it deserves to be mocked. But what I'd rather do is look back at a time, maybe surprisingly so for many people, but a time when I think a model of public conversation or public argument held sway. I'm talking about the High Middle Ages, the time when our own university system was born, and to a figure such as St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, when you look at the text of Thomas Aquinas, they can strike you as a tad turgid, but keep in mind, those texts are grounded in the typically medieval form of education, which was not the classroom lecture that came with Schleiermacher's University of Berlin, early 19th century. What we're used to, Herr Doctor Professor comes in, gives a lecture, people take notes. Well, that was not the medieval style at all. The medieval style was what they called the quaestio disputata, the disputed question. They were public, they were raucous, they were full of exchange of conflicting opinions. And what you see in Thomas Aquinas' writings is a kind of literary version of the quaestio disputata. So let me walk through one of Thomas's questions to show you how this thing worked. First of all, when Thomas begins one of his questions, he has what they call an utrum, whether. Most famously for him, utrum Deus sit, whether there's a God. First thing to notice here, here's a Dominican friar, a priest in the Middle Ages, who publicly asks whether there's a God. Well, as far as I'm concerned, if you can ask that question, you could ask anything. What's off limits? Watch how Thomas raises literally thousands upon thousands of questions, including that one. Talk about an openness to entertaining any question. There's the utrum. Now, the utrum is followed by a series of objections. Now, this would be a reflection of the quaestio disputata, when people from the floor in a public forum would say, well, I object to that, or here's why that can't be true, and here's a counter argument. Thomas would often take and distill the best of those and put those now in the literary form as the objections. And here's the really interesting thing. Very often, he would formulate the objection in a pithier and more convincing way than even the proponents of that position would be able to do. Good example, look in the article on God's existence, when Thomas formulates this darn good argument against God's existence. If one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be destroyed. If there were infinite heat, there'd be no cold, right? But God is called infinitely good. Therefore, if God exists, there wouldn't be evil. But there is evil. Therefore, there's no God. As I say, darn good argument. Now, Thomas will answer it. But my point is, he formulates the opponent's position very well. very convincingly. Might I suggest if we did a little bit more of that in our public conversation today, we took our opponent's position so seriously that we formulated it even better than they would, we'd be in a much better space. After the objections, Thomas gives what's called his respondeo, Latin for I respond. Here's his magisterial resolution of the issue. Now, in our postmodern period, we're kind of addicted to the permanently open-ended question, right? Well, there's no final answer. We just keep asking over and over again, look at different perspectives, we revisit, we come back. If you want to see a master class in this, read anything by Jacques Derrida, who's maybe the greatest proponent of this approach. But see, Thomas Aquinas knew what Chesterton knew, namely, the open mind is like an open mouth. It's meant finally to close on something nourishing. Thomas will give you an answer. It's not just a postmodern permanent postponement of the answer. He responds. He answers with something definitive. Then he comes back to the objections, and in light of his respondeo, he responds to the objections. Very often taking something positive in the objection and then incorporating that in his response. Now, can I suggest this method, which is lively, it's fluid, it's open, it's curious, it's attentive, is a wonderful model for a public conversation of even the most serious issues. And just one more observation. Notice everywhere in Aquinas, he cites, of course, the Bible and the Church Fathers. But Thomas cites Aristotle, Plato, Cicero. He cites a Jewish scholar like Moses Maimonides. He cites Arab Islamic scholars like Avicebron and Avicenna and Averroes. Thomas shows this remarkable breadth of mind. And when he cites these people, he does so in a very respectful, positive way. So, for example, Moses Maimonides, think in the Middle Ages, we think, oh, Christians and Jews at each other's throats and so on. Thomas always refers to Maimonides as Rabbi Moises in his Latin. Rabbi Moses says. A respectful engagement of a wide range of authorities, well outside your own kind of area of interest. A public argument about the most serious matters. Today, it seems increasingly, we're not able to have it. Can I suggest that Thomas Aquinas' method from the Middle Ages does represent a kind of safe space for argument, but a safe space for serious adults and not for timorous children? And might I further suggest, it's not a bad method for our own engagement of these public questions.